What's your I finally met my online friend horror story? Back during WoW's second expansion there was this guy in my guild I'd become friends with mostly through other friends. We talked more and more over time and became fairly close. He had this butthole roommate, and I could hear the guy sometimes, especially when something went wrong during a raid. He'd scream and throw fits. He was pretty awful sounding. My friend told me he wasn't just loud and obnoxious, but verbally and sometimes physically abusive, too. I had my own apartment, so I said, you know what, come stay with me, just long enough to get you on your feet and into a place that's safe. He showed up at my place with a trash bag full of his stuff and a laptop. I set him up in the apartment and started trying to help him find a job. Well, he did not want a job. He did not get a job, either. He sat in my apartment, day after day, eating my food and slowly draining my savings. No matter how hard I tried to get him motivated, he would just dig in his heels and somehow become more sedentary. Eventually I told him he had to go. I couldn't afford to keep him there. He was just couch surfing. I spoke to some people and eventually pieced together that his method of securing a new temporary place was playing on the sympathies of his friends to convince them he was in a terrible living situation. It just worked really well on me because he had that loud, obnoxious roommate to play off of. He wound up calling a nearby relative to come and get him, I think his aunt. I don't know what he told her I supposedly did, but I have never seen a more venomous look from someone in my life. As far as I know he moved in with his sister and brother-in-law after that, but frankly I don't care where he ended up. He also stole a bunch of my stuff. First and last time I do anything like that. It's bizarre to me that some folks see other people as means to an end and not human beings deserving of basic respect. I'm sorry to hear that happen to you. Don't let it dim your shine. This is more of an embarrassment story. When I was in high school in the 90s I was active on the local dial-up BBS scene. I was friends with someone who went by the handle Venus. I knew she was a woman but had no idea what she looked like. I also knew she was dating a guy in real life with the handle Lord Gumby who was also a friend online. Being a socially misadjusted 15-year-old I had a crush on her anyway even though I knew they were both like 18. This was like 1992 so privacy wasn't as big a concern and they knew my address. This was also when people would randomly come by your house to see if you were home. That's unfathomable today. So one Saturday morning I'm at home on my computer totally disheveled, unshowered, and just gross in ratty sweatpants and no shirt. I hear a knock on the front door and go open it. There's a woman who was incredibly beautiful standing there and she just goes, "Hi, I'm Venus." I stood there for a minute, it seemed like jaw dropped trying to say something when Lord Gumby walked up and was like, "Hey doofus, ever met a woman before?" Needless to say I wanted to sink into a hole in the ground and die. But I hung out with them and I guess I wasn't too horrible because we hung out a lot after that. But that whole time I was like, frick, my life choices, haven't talked to them in decades. I wonder how they are doing. You should find out if they're still around. They sounded like decent people in 1992. Met this dude on EverQuest and we've played games together ever since. Been a part of the same guild, help each other out on mobile games, and have conversations about life in general. It isn't him that's the horror story, it was his mom. So one day, I think we were playing WoW at the time, I log on to do some quests. Suddenly his user comes on and asks to chat by video. We've done this before and there's no problem, but after I click to start the video chat, there's his mom butt naked on the screen. She asks me to watch her masturbate and I'm like, no lady, this is just awkward AF, and I log off for a few days. I get an email from my friend and he wants to know why I haven't shown up for quests or anything. So I tell him what happened and he is seriously like, WTF. Turns out his mom had been doing this to a lot of his online buddies and she eventually goes to prison for raping a minor or two. Buddy's doing great though, wife and kids, plus we still play the occasional game together. Holy crap, I'm glad he turned out alright and that she went to jail. I never actually met the guy, but spoke to him on the phone. We'd met on MySpace when I was in college and exchanged email addresses when we realized we lived in the same town. Eventually, I gave him my phone number and made plans for him to call me. When he did, his voice creeped me out. It was how I imagined a serial killer would sound. By the time I got past it and was comfortable talking to him on the phone, I started noticing other red flags. Whenever I brought the neighborhood up, He changed the subject. At one point, I asked him what his favorite restaurant on the boulevard was and he hedged, so I made up a restaurant that I said was my favorite. He immediately said that was his favorite too and that he especially loved one of their dishes. He went on and on about this wonderful place that didn't exist, and there wasn't a similar one in town, so he couldn't be confused. I called him out on the fact that he'd obviously never been to my neighborhood. Turned out, he didn't even live in the same state as me. A guy in a forum for a specific hobby would talk to me a lot, but never revealed his real identity, until out of the blue he suddenly asked me to please come to see him in hospital, where he died a few weeks later. That's kinda super sweet. Dude just wanted a friend, not pity. Guy I knew in college met a girl online and spent every day talking about her. She lived about 6 hours away, so he planned to take a semester off and pursue this relationship. He got a job in her town and asked if I'd help him move out there since my car would hold more than he could take on a bus. I had a long weekend off and figured, why not? A road trip could be fun. I'd drive him out as a goodbye present, and the way back I planned to visit Yellowstone. Well, we arrive and it turns out he doesn't have an apartment lined up and he found a job posting in his girlfriend's town. He hadn't actually gotten the job, or even applied yet. I make a bunch of phone calls and find him a room to rent that will let him move in that day with just first, last, and deposit, even without a job. I'm tired and disgusted with his lack of planning, but figure it's worth staying the night and trying to end things on good terms with my buddy. Then he breaks down and confesses that he hasn't actually met this girl. The nights he spent video chatting with her were really just him watching her vlog and jacking it. They've never talked, never texted, never even emailed. Heck, he's never even left so much as a comment or like on one of her videos. She genuinely didn't, still doesn't, know he existed. His plan was to hang out at this game shop she talks a lot about until she showed up and somehow create a relationship from that. He thought that they'd meet and she'd fall in love with him and move back to our college town to marry him. All before the next semester began. That didn't happen. Instead, I made my buddy buy a bus ticket for his ride back to school and left. He came back to school and got more cringy, not less. I lost track of him after that. When I was younger I met an online friend in a public place for the first time. He was about my age and hadn't lied about that, so I guess I'll let my guard down. Anyway, after we walked for a while I noticed he had led me down a dark alley with no other people. He then looked at me and said how he really wanted to rape me right then and there. Right after he'd said that, my instinct kicked in, and I ran as fast as I've ever run in my life, until I came to the train station. Here I jumped on the first train I saw and got the heck away from him. Good that you made it. If anything it just confirms that I need to put my daughters into self-defense classes. I met a guy online. We really got on and he came over a few times so we could hang out. I did find him attractive and tried to hint that I was into him. Note, I can't flirt to save my life, but nothing ever happened. After a few dates he suddenly vanished offline. No social media. He wasn't answering texts or emails. Nothing. I thought he'd ghosted me. After 6 months he reappears. I asked him where he'd been and he said I don't want to talk about it. A few weeks after, there was a fad where people were googling their names and posting humorous stories they had found about similar people with their name. Mine was about a ship that had my initials. And I started to google friends' names just out of boredom, morbid curiosity. Googled his name and found a local news story from his area. One of those crime and you dodge a blank bullet. This is way back in the mid-90s. Bulletin board systems were all the rage. I made friends with this guy from NC. He was friends with a bunch of us from my dorm, mostly females, which should probably have been a red flag, but I was extremely naive at the time. A couple months in, he mentioned he was coming to our state for a wedding and asked if he could come by our college to meet everyone. It was agreed he'd sleep in my dorm room since my roommate was almost never around. Now, there was no discussion or thought of sex, but I was pretty excited to meet this guy and see if he was as funny and charming as he was online. Well, day arrives, dude shows up. I should mention that I and all my college friends were 18 or 19. This guy was 24, or so he said. Guy looked like And I'm not exaggerating. A cancer patient. Pale, gaunt features, long greasy pale blonde hair except where he was bald on top, and just generally looked like he was about to die or he was dressed as a ghoul for Halloween. He insisted on hugging all of us. I was trying to remind myself that looks don't matter and that he was a cool guy despite his very unsettling appearance. But then, when we all started hanging out, things just got worse. He was asking really invasive questions of all of us, making weird comments to whatever was said, just all around creepy and distressing. I was sitting on the floor with another friend and actively rocking back and forth from discomfort. I lied and said I had hurt my back and that sleeping on the floor helped, because that night he kept insisting we could share my tiny twin college bed. Nope. Last time I ever met anyone from that site. I know I wouldn't have slept that night. He and I were part of the same forum many years ago. He was dealing with his issues and I was dealing with mine. I think we both went there to escape, where people wouldn't judge. Also, because we were bored. I'm not quite sure when we got properly talking. I think it's when he told a terrible joke about kipper ties. We used to share everything with each other, over MSN. I'd give him advice about his love life and he'd listen to all my frick-ups. It took quite a few frick-ups before we eventually met up. I think I already knew we were in love, but seeing him in person really cemented it. We decided to give it a go, even though we lived 300 miles away from each other. We had a lot of ups and downs. I was distant. He lived with his ex-girlfriend for a bit even though she didn't have a job and couldn't afford her half of the rent. The same ex-GF who I'd given him advice on, who he had nicknamed Trouble and liked to claim she was pregnant every so often. We got over that, along with many other things, and finally moved in with each other. I thought our issues were gonna be solved when there was no distance between us. Ends up, we were just very different people who wanted very different things and the distance wasn't gonna change that. We broke up after 3.5 years together. None of that's the horror story. Not the way he treated me. Not the fact he probably cheated on me. Not that I wasn't a priority and used to cry myself to sleep. About 1.5 years after breaking up, he gets back in touch and we talk like it was in the beginning, when we were friends. After a few weeks, he asked if I want to get back together. I said no. I told him that he'd broken my heart again. The next day, I got a phone call from his work because I was still his emergency contact asking me if I knew where he was because he hasn't turned up. The police got in touch too. The last phone call that day was from his mum, to let me know that he'd killed himself. I've been active in numerous online communities over the years, and have been fortunate enough to hang out with many of the friends I've made there in person. There's only been one incident I couldn't cope with. He picked me up at the airport, which was very nice of him, and as soon as we got into the car, he started picking his nose. There's a lot that goes through your mind when you hop into a vehicle with someone you've never been alone with and you immediately catch them 2 knuckles deep in their rostrum. I looked quickly away so that he wouldn't know I caught him and be embarrassed if he was just trying to sneak one out before I noticed. If he did notice, he didn't seem embarrassed, so I relaxed a little. I guessed maybe he was just so confident about himself and our friendship that he'd ascended past caring if I saw him take care of a quick boog. Fine, sure. When I finally looked back at him, he was wiping his fingers across his dashboard. To this day I'm not really sure what to think, but this guy spent the entirety of the few hours we were together scooping out boogers and wiping them off on parts of his car or the table or wherever it was that we'd stopped at. I realized I was being transported in a rolling booger shrine and that there was nothing I could touch without needing to wash my hands. I was sitting on a crust of fossilized booger stuff. I had to be. I didn't want to hurt his feelings. He was a nice dude, but I wound up ollieing out of our visit early because I couldn't handle it. I don't consider myself a clean freak, but as wiping started to stack it was all I could do not to throw open the passenger door and roll myself out into traffic to escape. I still wonder if I should have done or said anything to save him some grief in the future, but it didn't feel like it was my place. You know? What do you even say? Wow, that really is a hilarious lack of self-awareness. Said he was 14. Turns out he was 38. My parents gave him a stern talking to. Born on a leap year obviously. After 4+ years of playing WoW together and chatting, online and on the phone, He invited me to visit him in Australia. I figured it was safe, since I'd known him for quite a while and had never gotten any weird vibes. No flirtation, no creepiness, nothing. 2 days into my very clearly stated platonic visit, he tried to rape me. I ditched all of my stuff except what I had in a small duffel bag and took off, traveling on my own for the 2 weeks until my flight home. A few months later, I received an unsigned postcard from the Gold Coast that just said, "Thinking of you," with a smiley face. That's creepy as frick. I used to play a war game and I was friends with this other person. Was a guy, and we became good friends and talked and all. Then out of the blue he asked me to be his girlfriend. He was a truck driver in the USA and I was only 12. It freaked me out a lot and I ghosted him. It was a terrifying experience and a real eye-opener for me. I used to play WoW with my now ex. Our guild leader actually wound up moving to our state with his wife. My ex and I broke up before we got the chance to hang out with the guy, and right after the breakup he messaged my ex essentially asking if it was cool if he and his wife got me drunk and took advantage of me. Ex showed me screenshots when I was getting my stuff from his place and I cancelled my plans to meet the guy and his wife. My ex had been physically abusive and broke up with me to date the girl he'd cheated on me with. I'd tried leaving before but he'd fake suicide attempts and I was so scared he'd go through with it so I stayed. Even though he was in a new relationship he tried to keep tabs on me and control me, but I saw it as my chance to escape. I happened to move right after we split and he didn't know my new address. I blocked him on everything. Somehow he kept getting information on me though. Turns out the guild leader was feeding him everything. I hadn't deleted the guy off Facebook cause I figured he was only a problem in person. When I confronted him over Messenger, bringing up the abuse, and the guy said, he said he choked you because you guys were arguing and he was afraid he wouldn't get the chance to speak. He still loves you. Side note, the choking was cause I was defending myself against accusations of cheating, which I hadn't done. I don't know if it's a horror story, but it's how I ended up where I live now. I played WoW for years with a pretty regular group, got to know them offline and at one point two of them, a couple, invited me to move across the country. At the time I didn't have anything tying me to where I was, so I packed up and moved. Got out here, moved in with my friends and everything seemed okay. My buddy was a long haul driver so he was always gone for days at a time. His girl would try to set me up multiple times with two of her friends at the same time, one in Minnesota. I ended up having a hard time finding work for a while. Finally got a job though and was putting some money away while helping watch their kids. Out of nowhere one day my buddy accuses me of trying to fool around with his girl. Nothing had ever happened, but I had noticed her spending more and more time in my room when he wasn't there. I knew his history and his previous relationship had ended after she cheated with a friend of his. He wouldn't listen, so I got kicked out without any warning and they stole about $1K worth of my stuff and later moved. Ultimately it all worked out for me. Cut the friend and his girl out of my life completely and moved on. Now I have a good job here, wife and kids. We were friends online for years. We'd meet up every so often and when we started families we'd meet up and take the kids to the zoos or whatever. She wanted us to go on a cruise together, with our husbands and kids. I made the comment towards the effect of we can't afford that, and she went nuts. We shouldn't have had kids if we can't afford them. We shouldn't have more children. Our life sucks blah 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 because I didn't want to go on a goddamn cruise with her and her bratty butt kid. Sounds like a nightmare. I love how we can't afford a cruise turned into you can't afford your whole life, you irresponsible pleb. I was the horror in this story. I was part of an online writing community that I really enjoyed and I made a lot of good friends through the years. One man and his wife were visiting from another country so another guy from my area and I were going to take them to dinner and have a nice in-person evening with sightseeing and conversation. Things kind of blew up for me at that time. My now ex-husband and I were having major issues and I was near my mental and emotional breaking point. I had lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks just from pure stress. On top of that, my family had chosen that evening to have a get together for my uncle who would soon be traveling to undergo surgery for cancer. I showed up in body, but that was basically it. My mind was a million miles away. I wasn't talkative at all, and I left after about an hour. I feel like I lost 3 good friends that evening because of my behavior at dinner and my subsequent withdrawal from the whole community. I'm sure they look back on that evening and think what a nightmare host I was. I was on Meet Me, met this guy who was super cool. We ended up texting every single day and I took the train out to Los Angeles to meet him. When I got there, he was being kinda crappy and he told me that he hadn't gotten much sleep because he was partying until 5 AM. We walked to his house and when I walked into his room, I was kind of shocked. It was a 8x6.5 room. All he had was a mat on the floor and a small little jewelry box full of mementos on top of his suitcase of clothes. We took a nap together. Later, we went to get ramen and he asked me to pay. I didn't mind. We went back to his place and we listened to music while we waited to go to a party. Fast forward to that night, we met up with some of his friends and they were so mean to him. They kept roasting him and picking on him and he was visibly getting upset. I stopped him for a bit so his friends could walk ahead of us. I reminded him that it was all fun and games and to ignore them. Ended up at the party and lots of people knew him. I sat out in the patio with a few cool people that I had just met while I waited for my friend to come back from saying hello to everyone inside. He never did. I was outside in the patio with these strangers for about 3 hours. People kept coming up to me and asking if I was alright. IDK if I looked sad or if I just looked like a plain loner. I went to find him and it was so packed. Didn't see him so I walked back. I seen his roommate and asked him to please tell my friend that I was gonna go get a motel. He went to tell him, came back and said my friend was being a dong and he would walk me back to the house instead so I didn't have to spend money on a hotel. We got to the house and I thanked him for walking all the way back home. I really appreciated it as my friend was probs inside doing coke or fricking girls. I went to bed in my friend's room and he woke me up in the middle of the night kissing me, trying to get his freak on. I simply said no. I'm not interested in having sex. His exact words were, "Are you serious? What was the point of you coming here? You're such a waste of time." My feelings were really hurt. I went back to sleep, woke up and left. Never wrote him after that. He had texted me a month later asking to borrow $50. I simply ignored the message and moved on. Sounds like a real piece of crap. I, 25, was best friends with a woman, 46, for nearly 6 years. We would talk for hours and send each other gifts constantly. We shared everything from art to personal trauma. We were very close. When I fell in hard times, she was very kind and offered to take me in. I was so grateful that she would do this for me. After a few months, things started to change. I started to see why she was such a lonely person. She was mean, if not cruel, to anyone who ever disagreed with her or even had a different opinion. She was so mentally unstable that she couldn't even buy something without having to call her elderly mother and ask for permission. I found out that she was scamming the disability services to get money from the government because she didn't want her mother tracking her spending. She was so horrible to her caregiver. I'll admit that the guy was a complete moron, but he was still a sweet guy that was just trying to help. She was so abusive towards him that I had to step in on multiple occasions, which she freaking hated because it meant I wasn't on her side. That's when she turned on me. She began to freak out over small stuff, screaming and crying because I missed a spot while mopping or because I spilled a little bit of water in the kitchen or ate my food too fast. She was freaking insane. As soon as I realized how messed up and unstable she was, after being screamed at and chased back to my room, I told her that I was going to be moving out as soon as possible. So, for the next week, she decided to make my life a living heck. She would scream about me to other people on the phone, telling lies about me, saying I did things I never did, and because she was a YouTuber with a big following, she doxed me on social media, telling people I punched holes in her walls and keyed her car. She even called the cops and tried to get me arrested for things I didn't do. Her followers began to harass me, sending me rape death threats. Then she started posting and sharing all of my personal secrets that I had shared with her in confidence. I ended up having to call my family to come get me because she was wanting to keep my dog so that I would have to keep in contact with her and I was no longer feeling safe. So, after 6 months of living in heck and 3 years of internet harassment and stalking that followed, I'll never meet someone I met online ever again. I have no interest in online friends. It's not safe because you never know how absolutely fricked up someone is until it's too late. Please, I just wanna know who this is. Back in about 1998, I met someone playing an online word game. We were both 16-year-old girls and we just hit it off and became very close. Finally in 2004 she was passing though where I live, so I invited her to stay for a few days. She shows up totally coked up. Then she invites some guy over and they were snorting C off her car key in my living room. I didn't know she used coke and I was so uncomfortable the entire time. It was like having a stranger there, yet we knew everything about each other. We remained in touch and I still really like her, but it was just such an awkward visit. We haven't seen each other since, though. Met up with a childhood friend who went to the same university as I did. Hadn't seen her since we were maybe 8, but like, wrote letters and stuff. Pre-internet days. We were stuck in traffic and she smoked in my car. I asked her not to. She just rolled down the window and refused to look at me the rest of the car ride. Oh, finally I have somewhere to tell this story, but it's probably too late to get any real traction. Long story short, when I was doing a lot of online dating I had multiple accounts across multiple platforms. One happened to be FetLife. I used pictures there that I hadn't put online before, with my face cropped out. It didn't pan out, however. I didn't really like any of the guys that messaged me. I was polite to them all but ultimately kind of abandoned my profile. Cue Tinder. I match with a guy that looks white collar, tailored, professional. Just my type. We match. Talk for a week or so until we decide to get drinks. I get to the bar, took an Uber there, and look around. Don't see him. Until this scraggly looking guy comes up to me and says, "Oh hey Grenadinigan. I thought you'd never make it now." I'm not unusually one to judge by appearances. We all have rough days and Lord knows I don't wear makeup or do my hair on the busiest of them. But his hair was significantly longer. Think short, well manicured hair versus mid-back length uncombed waves. He was covered in a patchy beard and dressed really badly. I honestly didn't recognize him, and he waved it off with sorry. Those pictures are kind of old. Red flag stupidly ignored. We grab a small table with huge chair and start drinking and talking. One drink, just to be polite, but I'm turned off at this point wholly. Then, the kicker. He leans in toward me, puts his hand on my thigh, and says, "You know, after you did message me back on FetLife, I'm surprised we matched on Tinder. You really are quite beautiful." At this point I'm like, "I'm sorry?" He chuckles. Literally chuckles like a villain in a movie, pats my thigh, and says, "I'm going to the bathroom. You should look at your profile and figure it out. I found you because your body is quite distinct. It's worth noting we live in a major international tourist city. There are thousands upon thousands of new people here every day, especially on Tinder. This is not a small town. I used to match with people that would swipe between connecting flights, so I'm beyond nervous." Watch him get up and go, and I quickly check my FetLife inbox and lo and behold, he had messaged me months ago. His profile picture looked like an absolute serial killer. I remember why I rejected him. Incompatible on all fronts, and I was polite. So anyways, I got to use the whole angel shot protocol, in which I basically ran to the bartender, explained the situation, and left through the back door. I was beyond uncomfortable, and deleted all of my social media for a few months, and I consider myself lucky that he only sent a few "your WSEC" messages for the rest of the evening but gave up after that, and I paid for my own drink, too. I'm not a monster. I don't even know why this is my favorite story in this thread, but it is. Like the paying for your drink stinger propels this into "this isn't happening" stand-up territory. Glad you made it out okay with a great story. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.